Now, anyone who's glanced at social media over the last few days will no doubt have seen some of the most horrifying sights, from hostages being aggressively dragged from vehicle to vehicle by armed Islamists to dead bodies of innocent Israelis being paraded mercilessly through the streets. The shameless and inhuman nature of the content splashed across our small screens over the past few days has led the UK's Technology Minister, Michelle Donnellan, to call an urgent meeting with social media executives to demand the removal of Hamas-incurred violence spread across their platforms after concerns were raised of misleading and historic footage portrayed as the current conflict. The Minister said, "We are taking action to stand in solidarity with Israel and our Jewish community. However, the violence we are witnessing is real. This is a difficult question. Should the full horror be shown so that we know the reality of what people have had to suffer, or does that glorify violence? I'm not sure I know the answer. Where do we draw the line between protecting ourselves and our children from this brutal content and making sure the general public know the full truth is what is transpiring?" Well, I'm pleased to be joined by Toby Young from the Free Speech Union. Toby, thank you for joining us, particularly as I believe there have been technological difficulties. There must be some limit to free speech, mustn't there?
Yes, I think there are. I don't think many free speech defenders, even people who describe themselves as free speech absolutists, would defend child pornography, for instance. They wouldn't necessarily defend libel, defamation, slander. They wouldn't defend the betrayal of state secrets. And where the Supreme Court generally draws the line is that anything which directly incites violence it should be prohibited, but anything beyond that shouldn't. But on the issue of Twitter and the footage that's been uploaded to Twitter of the atrocities committed in Israel on Saturday and afterwards, I think on balance they shouldn't be prohibited. I think it was an important corrective to the initial reporting of what was happening in Israel in the mainstream media, with even the BBC refusing to describe Hamas as terrorists. There was this sort of effort at impartiality, which often descended into both-sidism, displayed by the mainstream media, at least in the initial wake of the attacks. But when you actually could see footage on X of what the terrorists were actually doing, if you were strong enough to watch it, it became clear that these were terrorists. These were barbaric acts. People were being slaughtered, murdered, women's bodies were being desecrated, people were being kidnapped, including babies. And that put it all into a context which the mainstream media had really failed to do.
All right, but I had somebody on this programme on Monday night who, on watching television, had seen 5 of his friends who had died, and he only knew about it through seeing television. Now, if that weren't a friend of yours but were a member of your family, isn't that pretty brutal? And shouldn't there be some consideration for the thoughts of the bereaved when the bodies of people who have been brutalised are shown on television, and whether this is video pictures rather than television?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't advocate showing that kind of imagery on television. I mean, I think people have got to decide for themselves whether they want to see it, and they've got to be given adequate warning so they're prepared and know what they're letting themselves in for. It shouldn't just be broadcast on, the nightly news, that's for sure.
But are you given due warning on social media when you click onto it? Aren't you actually given much more warning on television, where the news broadcaster will say there may be some scenes that people will not want to see, and that there may be pictures of dead bodies and so on? So actually, a news programme will give you more warning than you open up Twitter and you find there's something there to catch your attention that turns out to be horrific.
Well, I don't think so. Most of the horrific footage that's been uploaded to X comes with a content advisory, a warning of some kind. And you can usually see a still image from the video in question before you click on it to watch it. So it's usually pretty clear if it's going to contain something disturbing. I mean, I'm a pretty frequent user of X, formerly known as Twitter, and I haven't been ambushed by anything. I haven't seen anything that I didn't want to see that's sort of taken me by surprise.
Well, thank you very much, Toby. Let's now turn to my panel, the prestigious former Labour councillor and public affairs guru, Kevin Craig, and the rambunctious former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie. Kelvin, you edited a national newspaper for a long time. You must have had to make these decisions as to what pictures you put in your paper when you were editor. How did you draw the line?
Right. Well, if we just take the position we are today, which is I pay for a number of news sites. A couple of them are free, but mainly they're subscription. So they're going through an editing process, right? It's not being thrown at me. And if I see anything, right, so anything I see on there, I'm saying to myself, somebody with some brains and some knowledge has actually already looked at this. That's good enough for me. I don't dwell on those pictures. I know what they're going to do. I don't believe that this comes as a surprise to people now that horrible things are happening out there. I'm actually in favour of them being on the news sites. I am personally not in favour of looking at them myself. When you make these decisions, honestly, I think I'd make a different decision when I was older than when I was younger. When you were younger, it was all gung-ho, we'll put it out there. When you get older, because you now have a whole load of family and friend relationships, similar to the one that you said about, well, what happened if it was somebody's family that was being videoed and were being shot, or some of the shocking things that have happened, then I think the decisions are different. So definitely maturity makes a difference. But some of these things are being put on there in order to show you it's the enemy who are putting them up there to say, we've got a lot more where that come from. So that is a very, very upsetting aspect.
Yeah.
Kevin, I mean, I agree with that when it's being put up by Hamas or supporters of Hamas, there's something particularly sinister and unpleasant about that.
Yeah, and I mean, this is such a depressing and deeply reflective week, given what's happened. And I agree with you, Jacob, there's something very unsettling about the impact on friends and family of the instant images and video that can be transmitted around the world. And if you think back to previous conflicts, the iconic power of images like, the young girl in Vietnam who was photographed having been affected by napalm, and the impact of some American soldiers who've been killed, the way it's done now, and it has been since really the last 15, 20 years, global conflicts are transmitted to ultimately our living room if you choose to engage with the websites. Is
it our living room, though, or is it it's actually the phone,
so
isn't it?
That's a good point. It is the phone and devices, and I think we have to exercise huge discretion as parents and grown-ups over younger people and their access to this material. I like the fact that the Secretary of State is convening this discussion, because ultimately I don't believe that the media companies, the online media companies, the tech giants do take enough responsibility.
The area where I'm torn is that some of the things one's read in the last few days are so horrible that it's hard to believe that they're true.
Yeah.
And that when there are pictures, you then know that it is true. And so there's part of me that feels it's important that they are shown, people know the horror. And there's the other part of me that thinks, but this is just so unfair on the families.
I think both those things are true, Jacob. I think the reality is that it will forevermore be difficult, unless you get into nation level like the Chinese do blocking, it will be very difficult in democracies to restrict totally this content. I think responsibility from the providers is important, and as Kelvin said, discretion and maturity in terms of what you choose to access online, because some of it is so deeply disturbing. But conflicts and the horror of war and terrorism are instantly available now.
Right. Well, that is the main difference, isn't it? That everybody has a phone. Everybody has a video camera, essentially. Yeah. They are all television cameramen, essentially. And they are doing it for lots of different reasons. We can see that in a fight outside a pub in Preston, right? Suddenly, you pick up one of the news sites, and there it is, a proper fight taking place in actually pretty good, clear video. Yeah. And this was something you would have never, ever seen before. And people actually, unfortunately, wallow in some of that violence. They won't be wallowing in this violence, but there is no doubt that if you looked at the numbers, if you asked Mail Online to show what people are clicking on, unfortunately, you would have a different view of humanity and morality than the one we're discussing.
And that's the really nasty side of it, that the glorifying of violence is the bit that you want to stop. Yeah. How do you persuade the tech companies to do this? And do you want them being the arbiters of taste anyway?
I'm not sure. I think that's a really good question, Jacob. I'm not sure I want Elon Musk arbitering anything, really.
He's not arbitering it.
No, that's the problem.
That is his difference between his ownership and the previous ownership.
But I don't much want a Secretary of State doing it either.
Well, perhaps not, but I think...
What about a Labour Secretary of
State?
No,
I'll tell you what, so forget Labour Tory, I think it's a healthy thing that a Conservative Secretary of State is convening this discussion, because my overall view is that a lot of the large platforms do not sufficiently exercise responsibility.
We've got the EU now saying, actually, we are going to... they can fine you, I think, 6% of your gross revenue because of the stuff that's being put up on this site.
I've got no problem with what the EU have come out with,
That seems to me to be moving on to a very different discussion from this one.
Yeah.
But for once, we've had a discussion where there isn't a clear answer, that normally, this panel particularly, we know exactly what we think, where it should go. But ladies and gentlemen, it's up to you. You must decide, you must take responsibility for what you watch and what you decide to look at. And personal responsibility is fundamentally important.